beyond delighted that we're having a conference that's talking about loving relationships and has the word love in the title. Because actually when we talk about professional care and professional services, we're often afraid to talk about love. And if we're going to understand what babies need, what they need is love. Because if they don't feel love that feels safe, then it affects their brains and their worlds and their futures and the way our whole society functions. So, when I started to put together my comments for today, I thought, what might I call it? And I settled on our human need for love, why it's the problem and why it's the solution. Because we often think of love as a sweet thing, except that the fact that we need love actually causes problems in some ways because it causes challenges to our services. So when I thought, where might I start? An image of what we think love is really helps to ground us. I want to talk about love, and I want to ground us because I also want to talk about fear. I want to talk about what it feels like to think about embedding love in more services, because I think that's scary for us. So I want to do something brave this morning. I want us to do something brave this morning. I want to see if we have the courage to think about what it takes to put more love into services. Does that sound okay to you? Are you up for a round of courage before 11 o'clock in the morning? Because we're going to need that if we're really going to think about what the science is telling us. But if we're going to start with love, who else could you start with except these guys? Do you know who these guys are? Do you recognize them? This is the Beatles in 1967 on the 25th of June. Do you know what happened on the 25th of June, 1967? A particular song was launched. You might be familiar with it. It's called Yay! Some of you were probably there at the time, but for those of you who might not have been, on the 25th of June, 1967, a global event occurred. It was the very first time in which countries could be linked on television across the globe by satellite. So, the BBC and a number of other television services get together to host a 2-hour program that represents their country. And so it's the first ever global television link, and it's broadcast to 30 countries with, they figured, a viewership of 400 million people. And every country has to choose 2 things that represent their country. So if you were the government, if you were Fiona MacLeod and Nicholas Sturgeon, and we were doing that today, what would we choose to represent us? Or if we were David Cameron or we were Barack Obama, or that's the decision they had to make. And then that was broadcast across the world in a program called Our World. And Britain chooses the Beatles, singing All You Need Is Love. So when the UK is asked to submit something that represents their country, our country, we compare that to France, who does high art, and America, who submits rockets. Britain submits a bunch of hippies singing All You Need Is Love. And that breeds controversy. So here's some of the things that were said at the time. It drew condemnation from viewers who said that the performance had dragged Britain's good name through the mud. We did not do ourselves justice. Have we nothing better to offer? Surely this is not the image of what we are like. What a dreadful impression they must have given the rest of the world. we flaunted the Beatles as the highlight of British culture, no wonder we have lost our image in the eyes of the world. The Beatles singing about love turns out to be highly controversial. It's not what everyone thinks that we should be about as a country. That's interesting, that love becomes controversial. Now, can I ask how many people remember this and were there that day watching television? Put up your hands. That's a very small, look around this room. Look, they're all proud. They're all proud, the ones who were there. But perhaps, since most hands have not gone up, we've forgotten this. That Britain is represented by the Beatles singing All You Need Is Love as the representation for Great Britain around the world. So you probably won't have any idea what the second image that was broadcast was. Does anybody know where that is? The second image, article that was submitted for Britain in 1967 was the Scottish new town of Cumbernauld. How do you like that for controversy? The best Britain can offer is the Beatles and Cumbernauld. Here's the image. Here's one of the images that was used to publicize that. Born Sunday, June 25th at 3 p.m., but into what kind of world? So we have an image of a baby. I love that several of you gone like this with your eyebrows. You think this is perhaps a bit of a harsh image of a baby. But this is one of the posters that went out at that time. Our world. Because you can't read it at the bottom, here's what that says. The little text there at the bottom, it says, I love this, a special world-girdling live television presentation uniting the television services of 30 nations for a 2-hour look at the world this moment, the hungry world, the crowded world, the physical and artistic world, and finally, the world of tomorrow. We are that world. We are the world of tomorrow that they wondered about in 1967. And here's the world I think we are living in. I want to tell you a story. I want to share with you a number of stories. They're all stories that are sent to me as I talk about attachment and relationships. This one comes from 3 weeks ago at the Children First Conference for Kinship Carers. It's a story about a grandmother. The problem for the grandmother was that she found herself in disagreement with the social work team. They felt that the child, who's 2, should be enrolled in nursery because he's showing speech delays and he doesn't seem to be very confident in mixing with the other children. So they thought that time in nursery would address both those problems. But the grandmother disagrees. She knows her grandson is anxious and clingy, and she thinks that he needs more time with her. When she argues that, the social workers reply that the Scottish government has recently increased nursery hours for all looked after 2-year-olds. And therefore, that demonstrates a belief that that is where looked after 2-year-olds belong. They think the child should be in nursery. But the grandmother's worried, and she refuses to act because she thinks he doesn't belong in nursery and he needs more of her arms. So the result of that clash, when a person stood up to share this story at that event, there was a big silence. The result of that clash is that the social work team comes to her home. They state that if she's not going to take the child to nursery, it's their responsibility to do so, and they take a screaming toddler out of her arms and transport him to nursery in their car. That's the point at which the grandmother gives in, because she's afraid that if she fights any longer, they'll remove him from her care for good. I'm worried. I'm worried that in a country that is doing so much to think about the needs of our children, that there are some policies that are actually guided by fear. Because let me share another story. This one came in via email to me. As a kinship carer, I'm still very angry that my wee cherub had 5 foster placements in her first 2 years. If the social work policy had been to support me financially, then she would have been in my care since she was 10 days old. But they don't provide money for kinship carers. They only provide money for foster placements. If they paid me to be with her, it wouldn't have cost any more than the foster placement they already had to pay for. As it was, I had to wait until I was in a position to take a 2-year career break to facilitate taking both girls. I'm worried that we have, perhaps entirely unintentionally, some policies that are meant to do good things, but that are actually instilling fear in some of our children, and some of our grandmothers, and some of our parents, and indeed in some of our professionals. Now I say that in the midst of being so excited about what we've been doing. So in the 10 years since Parenting Across Scotland was established, we've achieved a whole lot of things as a country. Earlier this week, here's Nicola Sturgeon at Edinburgh Castle, earlier this week with a couple of wee lasses, announcing that every young mom under 19 years of age will receive the Family Nurse Partnership throughout Edinburgh. That's the first time that Family Nurse Partnership as a program has been rolled out so widely within a local community. Here's another example. The Scottish Government's Play, Talk, Read campaign has reached all sorts of families. Play, Talk, Read have been put together. And in January, working with my team and Starcatchers, one of the creative arts programs for young children, this was the title across more than 50 newspapers across the country, encouraging parents to laugh more with their children. We celebrated Scotland's Big Laugh across the country, and we had coverage in newspapers of 4.2 million people talking about laughter in a Scottish January. That's amazing. How about this? The Early Years Collaborative. We've already heard about the Early Years Collaborative. The strapline is, best place in the world to grow up. Early Years Collaborative is about early years. I think it's fabulous that we have 89 out of 400 programs that are talking about attachment. I think it's worrying that we have 400 minus 89 projects not talking about attachment. We cannot be the best place in the world to grow up until we understand that every project in the country has to be talking about attachment, or it won't change young children's experiences in the way that it has to, in order to make the outcomes for them that we want. So I want to celebrate 89 out of 400, and I want to worry about the remainder that have to be affecting children's attachment relationships and may not realize it, and may not conceptualize it that way. Here's something else I want to celebrate. This is Harry Burns. Harry Burns was our chief medical officer for 7 years, and he's the guy who talks about liver cancer and heart disease and alcoholism and all sorts of things, and goes about the world talking about attachment. Indeed, talks about the chemical structure of a cuddle. Harry Burns, chief medical officer, talks about the way in which cuddles will solve our health problems. He's visionary. He's made a really big difference to Scotland and to Scotland, the way we are perceived across the world now. Except let me tell you another story. This is another newspaper headline. Nursery kids denied a kiss and a cuddle. Rising numbers of nurseries ban physical contact to stop pedophile accusations. I hear from nurseries all over the country that are scared to cuddle their children because they're afraid they will be accused of inappropriate touch. So if we're going to have children in nursery care for for 1,100 hours and they don't get cuddles, we will be making lives scarier for them. Let me tell you another story. Do you know who these guys are? These are the 7 guys just convicted in the Oxfordshire serious case review. One of the mothers of one of those brutalized girls was interviewed on Women's Hour last week. Here's what she had to say. Things really started to go wrong for my daughter when she started to be excluded from school at a moment's notice during that year when she was 12. So there's some schools in Oxfordshire who thought that it would help a vulnerable young girl to exclude her at a moment's notice because they were frustrated with her behavior. What this mother is implying is that schools trying their best to cope with difficult circumstances thought it was a good idea to exclude a child, and she ended up brutalized by men who, I guess, have been brutalized themselves. That broke the relationship between that young woman and her teachers. Let me tell you another story. This is Smiley, the crossing guard, over in Dumbarton. He's been in the news this month because when the children cross at his crossing guard, he sings and dances and gives them a high five. And the council told him to stop. The council told him he was endangering the children. The council told him that he was meant to stand like this and not engage with the children. And he certainly wasn't meant to high five them because there's a restriction on touching children. Doesn't he know that? Now there's a Facebook campaign to get Smiley reinstated. Why doesn't the council already know that Smiley is probably an asset for those children? When you have someone greeting you at the crossing guard, you have a different hormonal flow. Those children will arrive at school ready to learn, more ready to learn, because somebody high-fived them and did a little dance. Why doesn't the council already know that? I think these are stories of fear. These are stories about what people who make policy are scared is going to happen. Because fears are always about the future. You can't be scared of something in the present. You can hate something in the present. You can be in pain over something in the present, but you cannot fear something in the present because it is happening. Fears are always about the future. I think we are telling ourselves stories that make us fearful about what might happen. Fears are stories we tell ourselves. That councils tell themselves, that managers tell themselves, that ministers tell themselves. What if the stories that we are telling ourselves are stories of fear rather than stories of love? And what if we don't even realize we're doing that? That we think we're keeping ourselves safe. I'll bet the council really does think that they're keeping children safe by getting Smiley to stand there like that. So, let me tell you another story. Let me tell you a scientific story. The scientific story that we now have says that babies arrive in the world ready to love, ready to engage in relationships. They arrive with brains expecting connection. That's what it means to have a human brain, that you arrive expecting connection. Brains need to keep our hearts beating, our lungs going in and out, our blood flowing. Once it's done all the things to keep us alive, the next most important thing a human brain does is connect with somebody else. And that matters for the whole of our life. What we're talking about matters not just today for parents and children, but it matters for dementia care homes as much as for nurseries. How do we help people to understand that this lies at the heart of everything we're talking about? Because it just looks like a cute bear playing with a mom. How do we help people to understand that it's shaping brain development? Well, what you do is tell them. And you get them excited. Because what starts to happen when they get excited is they send you lots of images. So this is an image that I got sent on my Facebook page after somebody had been to a training with me and said, This is it, this is it. This is what you meant, isn't it, Suzanne? This is my mom with my wee one, minutes old. This is the connection you meant, isn't it? This is her brain connecting, isn't it? So I have an excited mom who wants to share with me a picture of her baby. And she gets, we're talking about a brain. She gets that this picture is saying something about her baby's brain and her capacity to connect with her grandmother at birth. And once you start this, lots of people do this. So I was in a meeting last week, and clearly somebody else said, we're in a meeting with Suzanne, and quick as a flash, whoever she was talking to texted back and said, you're with Suzanne? Show her the baby! So this arrived in the middle of a meeting. A mom and a baby picking up their tongues, demonstrating connection. And at another event I was at recently, where there was a baby, somebody sent me a picture that they snapped of me doing the same thing. People get that this is about connection. More and more people are talking about it. And yet, I am still worried that we may have policies of disconnection functioning. And that those policies of disconnection are fueled by fear that we may not realize. That's not the first time in this country that we have tackled that. One of the key stages in the attachment science story goes back to 1952, when our hospital policies restricted parents from visiting their children. If you had a 2-year-old who was ill with chickenpox or diphtheria or a broken leg or needing an eye operation, and you took your 2-year-old or your 7-year-old or your 6-month-old to hospital, you left your child in the care of professionals and you came back during visiting hours, which were often once a week. Oh, that's good. Several of you have just gone. Good. Because we need to remember that. Because in 1952, some people began to get worried about that. And one of the things that happens is that they make this film. This is a 2-year-old goes to hospital, and that's the cover of it. That's a 2-year-old in hospital without her parents. It's made by a guy named James Robertson. Can I ask how many people know of James Robertson? Put your hands up. Look around this room. Brilliant. How many people know this film, A 2-Year-Old Goes to Hospital? Look around the room. That's brilliant, except it's not all of you. We need it to be all of us. And here's what you may not know about James Robertson. James Robertson was Scottish. James Robertson was born in Rutherglen. I think we should reclaim him because he had amazing insights about the needs of children. He spent his life campaigning to change hospital policies because he was brave enough to ask, might they be damaging children? And that was scary for nurses and doctors who thought that they were providing good care to children. And when James Robertson says that this is not a settled child, but a child who is experiencing emotional deterioration, it was a scary time for our country and for our professionals. Now, how can we help people to know that? Well, if you're interested, one of the things my team is now doing is having things that we call Connected Baby Film Nights. And the next film night will be in April. It can take place in any community across the country. If there's not one in your community, then volunteer to help us put it on, because that's the film we have scheduled. If you want to know more, there are these flyers out on one of the tables. There are also other things on that table. There's information about connection. There's information about other resources that we are creating. Because my question is, how do we help people to get this? Because I want to tell you another story that James Robertson collected in 1962, 10 years after he had made that film. This is from a book where he collects experiences of parents. My husband and I nearly broke our hearts when we went to visit our daughter during the allowed visiting period of 6:30 to 7 p.m. She just screamed and clung to us, nearly choking us. She had to be forcibly removed from us by the sister. My husband was moved to tears, as well as me, when we got out of that ward. Fortunately, she was allowed home after only 2 days, because I think she must have cried those entire 48 hours. Does that sound shocking? It's actually not unlike the story of the grandmother that I started with. Why? Why couldn't they see what for us seems so apparent from a single story? Well, Robertson said that the reason they couldn't see was because their jobs were hard as nurses. He said this, that the young student professional who in the beginning may be seriously affected by the distress of young children separated from loved ones will in time develop a second skin against being upset by these painful sights and sounds. He says that if you're a nurse surviving in a ward of screaming children that you can't get to calm down because their parents have left, you have to squash those feelings or you can't get to work. Here's how somebody else described Robertson's insights in this lovely book called The Making of the Democratic Self in Post-War Britain, published in 2013. Robertson's explanation for the fact that the nurses did not notice the children's distress, which was really obvious to him, was that nurses needed to repress their own anxieties in order to grow accustomed to the children's misery and to perform their work. Robertson is saying that if the nurses couldn't find a way to steel themselves against children's distress, they may as well have stayed home in bed, pulled the covers over their head, and not gone to work. I want to share with you another story. This one, someone sent to me on Facebook after my last blog on this. These are powerful and distressing stories, Suzanne. I would have hoped that your statement is not true when you say, it seems that despite 70 years of attachment science, we still don't get it. But your stories made me wonder. I work with grown-up men in prison, and on a daily basis I found myself thinking, well, if I'd had the start in life that you've had, mate, I'm not sure I'd have turned out any different from you. May this message of connection be heard, Suzanne, so that this cycle can stop. The decision not to build another women's prison that was recently taken is a victory for attachment science. But it took a campaign, a hard-fought campaign by people to say, this is why a women's prison is a bad idea. What if those people had not had the time and energy to campaign? We would certainly not have been stopping this cycle. So what to do? You are very brave to do this with me. We are talking about loving relationships, and I am doing something outrageous. I am trying to make you uncomfortable. And I'm doing that because that's what Robertson thought needed to happen. So this very wise Scottish man who came from working class roots said this is what needs to happen. He said, the major obstacle to suitable care is neither practical difficulty nor lack of knowledge. It is that whatever level of intellectual understanding, however much we get attachment theory, however much that obtains throughout the professions, the appropriate sense of urgency and alarm is missing. He thinks we are not anxious enough, that we waste children's lives because we have repressed our own feelings. Now there's one other person there are lots of people thinking about what to do, but one of the other leaders is our beloved Harry Burns, and he thinks this is what we do. He says, I have worked with every health minister in some capacity since 1999, and they've all wanted to do the right thing. If you present them with the evidence, they are convinced, and they want to move the agenda forward. So what we have is a comparison of head versus heart. Do we need more evidence? Or do we need our hearts to move with urgency and anxiety. Because if our hearts don't move with urgency and anxiety, then it means we can't see children's pain, and we too have repressed our ability to feel their pain. So let me share with you one last story. This was sent by a social worker. One of the issues we face as social workers is the incredible pressure on us to secure placements for children who require to be accommodated versus a distinct lack of foster carers. I think this may explain the transition you described in your blog of having only 10 days from foster carers who had had a child for 2 years to their new adoptive parents. That was the length of the transition period, 10 days. I think that may explain it, although it would have been damaging to the child concerned. Workers are faced with coping with these pressures, even though they would desperately like to do the right thing by the child. Here's a social worker who knows she's damaged a child because she has to put in place policies and because she has terrible pressures on her. If you have a child go from a loving home, which is what we want a good foster care to be, to new parents, and it happens in 10 days, do you know what that feels like to that child? That's a bereavement. Their parents died. I'm doing something really outrageous. I'm trying to make us really uncomfortable. You are really kind and brave to do this with me. And I wanted to do it at the beginning of the day because I wanted us to think about every single thing we are going to hear about loving relationships throughout the day. I wanted us to put it in the context of what our policy and our practice is currently letting us do. Because if we have foster care that is creating bereavements for children, I want us to at least know that that's the best we can do. If that is the best we can do, okay, but we need to do it knowingly and not in a repressed sense. Because in case we don't know that a bereavement for a 3-year-old child is a bad thing, we've got lots of evidence. Here's some that was out in December. This is a new study out which looks at trauma for children across the US, concludes that half the children in America count as traumatized. Here's what they found. That the key predictors for later outcomes in adulthood, these are the key predictors they found, and first amongst them is parental death. So there's some very strong evidence, but guess what? I don't think we actually needed that evidence. The evidence is fascinating, and I could talk about it all day. But we don't actually need the evidence to tell us that having a bereavement when you're young is damaging for a life. So if it is really the case that the very best that we can do in our foster system is to create bereavements for children, we need to be aware of that. Or we need to think, could we rethink it? Because on Tuesday, I had a foster carer who sat in a training who said, I have a 3-year-old. I'm his second placement. So he's had 2 bereavements. He's lost his family, he's lost his first foster care. And by next year, he won't be with us anymore. And I said, can you not keep him? Does that not work for your family? And she said, no, we want to keep him. He's like one of ours. But the social workers say that they have to find an adoptive family. There's a 3-year-old in our country at the moment that we could prevent a bereavement for. But at the moment, the social workers who take care of his case think that what they have to do is find an adoptive placement. What this study found was that children who were exposed to 2 or more traumas were 2.5 times more likely to disengage from school. They were also more likely than the others to suffer from chronic health problems such as asthma, ADHD, autism, and obesity. If we take that 2-year-old away from the foster family who loves him at the moment, we're going to cost the National Health Service money. It's not a very good economic decision to not retain connections wherever we can. So, to go back to the beginning, in 1967, They wondered what kind of world children were being born into. And I think amongst all the wonderful things we are doing, our children are still being born into fear. And the answer to fear is love. Love is all you need. But for some people, love is hard to get. And for some services, love is hard to instill because it causes controversy. If you are going to go back to your setting and argue for whatever changes you think may need to be made, cuddling children in nursery, changing social work, transitions for children in foster care, letting more crossing guards do a little dance and jiggle and a high five, it's going to be controversial. There's going to be some people who think that it's not very serious. There's going to be some people who are shocked and scared. There's going to be some people who will say, well, they will drag the name of our council through the mud. It will take courage to do this. But if we cannot find the courage of our hearts and the courage of the Beatles, then we damage our children unintentionally because they come to us with brains ready for connection and relationship, which is what we celebrate all day today. And what I want to be sure is our children are celebrating that. Every single one of our children, we are getting it right for, so they are able to celebrate connection in their lives, just as we are celebrating it today. Thank you very much.